He was still surprised, but he had dropped to a knee and peeked around the corner. "Hey," he called. "Stop that." I didn't hear a response, but I did hear the whites down the hall behind me, the same hall that had been my refuge from the arrows that just flew up the length of the other hall. It was now a trap. I jumped to my feet as I raised my machete. The whites weren't running, at least not fast, as they were having trouble finding footing with all the dead and debris on the floor. I stepped into the first one's charge and dealt a mortal wound that didn't kill him instantly but would prevent him from ever getting off the floor again. Thank God for all the crap. It was keeping the whites from massing and charging me, that and their inherent greed. They all wanted to have the first bite of warm flesh. They all wanted to taste hot blood pumping onto their tongues. I killed the second one, dead before his knees buckled. Behind me, Murphy was shouting, but I didn't give a thought to what he was saying or what he was doing. I saw more whites coming down the hall toward me, and if I didn't take them all out, I'd be dead. Either Murphy would handle his end of the problem or he wouldn't. That's just the way it goes. I sloughed off the fucked-up emotions that had been bothering me all day, calmed myself, and solved my problems one at a time, clinically, efficiently, letting the whites do the work with their zealous momentum and greed. I only had to make sure one of my blades was in the right place, held steady in a firm hand, or swung with just enough force to get the job done. And then it was. All were dead. Too soon. I stood in the hall, 20 feet down from the stairwell, unaware I'd even worked my way so far. Immersed in the zen of heartless slaughter, I lost track of other things. It was all I wanted. All I needed. "Hey, ninja boy." I drew in one last breath of demon peace, felt one more moment of warm blood running over my skin, and turned to look at Murphy, who was out of the stairwell, standing in the hall and grinning like a little kid at a birthday party. "What the fuck, dude?" He waved me over and pointed up the other hall. I worked my way over the bodies. "You're not going to believe this." I rounded the corner and looked. Down at the other end of the hall, two whites stood naked but armed. One with knives in each hand, the other generously tattooed and carrying a bow. They looked familiar, but I couldn't immediately make the connection as to why. Murphy punched me in the shoulder. "Grace and Jazz, that's them, dumbass." My mouth fell open. "Holy shit." "Wow," said Grace. "I thought you'd be dead." Jazz pulled an arrow back in her bow. "If you don't stop looking at me that way, Zed, I'm going to put this arrow right through your pervert eyeball." Chapter 26. Awkward is the best word to describe it. Murphy and I walked to the far end of the hall. Lots of smiles. Everybody looking at everybody else's private parts while pretending not to. No hugs. "I'm happy to see you guys made it," said Murphy. Mostly he was looking at Jazz. Grace nodded at me. "We were out scrounging when the naked ones showed up. We didn't get caught in the fight." I couldn't help but look her up and down again. Grace rolled her eyes and turned to Murphy. "We figured the best way to help was to take a page from Zed's playbook and fit in with these naked ones and kill them while they were busy trying to kill everybody else." Murphy scanned the hall. "All of these?" Jazz shook her head. "The Aggies did most of this. We didn't realize the infected were in these buildings with the scientists until it was too late," said Grace. "It was too late everywhere." Jazz frowned but looked more hurt than angry. "We checked the outposts," said Grace. "They had them set up all around the perimeter of the veterinary science complex." "Fritz showed us," I said. "Fritz made it?" Jazz asked, perking up. "Where is he?" I pointed vaguely northwest. "We put him and some other people from the infirmary on the helicopter to Fort Hood." "Wait." Grace stepped toward me, very interested. "Fort Hood? The Army is there? Is it a safe zone?" "It was at first." Murphy shook his head. "The regular Army had it that way, but, you know, the virus hit them like everybody else. Then that bunch of yahoos who chased your guys out of the capital, the Survivor Army, took over Fort Hood and made it their base." Grace's shoulders slumped.
I don't understand.
Long story, I cut in. Bottom line, most of the Survivor Army assholes are dead.
How?
She asked. Murphy looked at me. Grace said,
What aren't you telling us?
These naked whites got 'em, I told her. Not the whole truth, but not a lie. Me and Murphy came across a helicopter pilot while we were scavenging.
Wait.
Grace raised her hands.
What were you doing in Killeen? We dropped you naked in the middle of the night, like 70 miles from there.
Like I said, long story. I looked up and down the halls, thinking more whites should be coming to find the source of our talking. Grace saw me looking and pointed toward the end of the hall where Jazz had nearly skewered me with a couple of arrows.
If you killed the ones down there, then I think this floor is clear.
Anyways, said Murphy, we got this dude with a helicopter, loaded it up with ammo and guns, and came here because, we said we'd meet you here. He looked again at the dead on the floor, and the happiness he'd been gushing since seeing the girls turned back to the morose mood he'd been in since the helicopter dropped us on the drill field. But it looks like we're too late to do any good. I elbowed Murphy.
Don't be such a pessimist.
We saved Fritz and those people from the infirmary. We're rescuing Grace and Jazz now. Jazz laughed harshly.
We're doing fine, Sir Galahad.
Sorry, I told her. That's not what I meant. Chapter 27. We organized ourselves with Murphy watching the stairs at one corner of the building and Jazz watching the stairs at the opposite corner. The only other way to get to the fourth floor was to use the elevators, and they didn't function. The roofs of the veterinary sciences buildings had been covered with a hodgepodge of solar panels, just as the pharmacy building had been, but non-essentials like the elevators had been disconnected from the limited supply of electricity. Of course, thinking back to my experience in Brackenridge Hospital back in August, the whites bravely climbed the elevator shafts. Conclusion? The veterinary sciences building was indefensible. Grace and I walked a third of the way down a hall that I hadn't yet seen. The inside wall of the corridor was lined with glass-faced oaken cabinets, 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, that looked antique and weighty as well. I guessed the cabinets had been moved to this much newer building when their original home on campus had been repurposed. The myriad of taxidermied animals and formaldehyde-preserved specimens that had been in the cabinets were on the floor among the dead. Most of the stuffed animals had been ripped open, probably by whites disappointed at what they found inside. One cabinet was out of place against the opposite side of the passageway. When we got to it, Grace said,
Help me slide this out of the way. The stockroom door is behind it.
Good idea, I told her. The whites didn't know there was a door, so they didn't move the cabinet and try to break in.
Brilliant, Sherlock.
Sherlock? I would have complained about the sarcastic nickname, but I was sure I already sounded whiny.
I heard Murphy say it,
replied Grace. I sighed, and we both got on one side of the cabinet and pushed. The cumbersome thing must have weighed 400 pounds. The cabinet's feet screeched on the floor, and Jazz leaned out of her stairwell to hush us with a gesture. In a voice just loud enough to reach the stairwell door, Grace asked,
Infected?
Jazz shook her head.
Just be quiet.
Grace looked at me, and we both put our shoulders back into moving the cabinet. It screeched again, but exposed the door hidden behind. Grace stepped away to catch her breath. She looked me up and down.
I thought I was going to have to trade you in for Murphy.
I tried not to pant and reveal what an effort it had been to move the massive oak display case. I'm stronger than I look. Grace stepped up to the door and knocked gently.
It's me.
The doorknob clicked, and the door swung open. The room wasn't as small as I expected, maybe 15 by 15 feet with metal shelves around the walls and a row of shelves down the center, filled with jars and bottles of who knew what, specimens, chemicals, and whatnot. The shelves didn't leave a lot of space for the men and women squatting on the floor and standing inside. Some of them had weapons in their hands. A few rifles, a pistol. One of them, an older man who looked to be a skeleton with a bowed back and bald head, stepped out of the stockroom as he looked at Grace through thick glasses.
"Well, the building is clear,"
said Grace,
"though more infected came in downstairs, and there's nothing we can do to stop them." "That's disheartening,"
said the old man. He looked at me.
"Who's this? Another white-skinned survivor like you?" "He's from Austin,"
said Grace.
"We met him and Murphy, also a white-skinned survivor, before we left to come here." "They're the ones you came with?"
he asked.
"The ones you lost along the way?"
He smiled, showing old yellow teeth as he looked at me. I extended a hand to shake. "Zed Zane."
"Pleased to meet you."
He shook my hand.
"Dr. Oakes, but I suppose you can call me Melvin if you want. Mel, if you're the casual type."
"Dr. Oakes." I smiled, though the casual encounter was making me nervous. Slipping into old-world habits had never done anybody any good. I looked over my shoulder for whites who weren't there, and I cringed when the people from inside came out into the hall, relatively quiet but making entirely too much noise.
"Don't go too far,"
said Grace,
"in case we have to get you back inside." "They're tired,"
said Dr. Oakes.
"And they're frightened."
"They need to get used to that," I told him.
"That they do,"
said Dr. Oakes.
"Things are changing for the worse again." "Yes, they are,"
Grace agreed. Dr. Oakes started walking up the hall, stretching his legs in slow steps.
"I need to get the circulation going."
He reached over and patted my belly.
"I'm not a lean young man anymore. Not for about 50 years, I guess."
He laughed at his joke, and that turned into a series of coughs. When he got past that, he pointed at the bodies strewn on the floor in front of us.
"It's going to smell pretty bad in here by this time tomorrow."
"Yes," Grace agreed. Dr. Oakes stopped and looked Grace in the eye.
"I'm sorry, I didn't thank you."
Grace shook her head uncomfortably.
"My dear, just say you're welcome." "You're welcome."
She smiled thinly.
"What is the state of things?"
Grace looked down the hall.
"There were no more survivors in the veterinary science building."
She pointed up and down the corridor.
"You're it."
Dr. Oakes frowned and set his jaw purposefully.
We lost more than 30 of our colleagues. That'll be hard to recover from."
He heaved a sigh into his rattling old lungs, and he frowned.
"It will get worse."
"Because of the others?" Grace asked.
"Nearly none of the volunteers survived the attack." "It may not matter,"
he said in a quiet voice.
"They won't have much to protect soon anyway." "Don't give up now, Dr. Oakes,"